I buried my daughter with another girl's face. Asterisk people called me heartless. But they never heard her last breath. This is the secret I carried longer than my grief. I am old now. My hands thin like dry leaves, and my voice softer than it once was. But every night when the house goes quiet and the walls stop listening, I see my daughter's face not as it was at the end, but as it lived. And tonight I will finally tell you the truth the way it happened. Because stories don't belong to the young alone, and pain does not retire with age. My name is Evelyn Moraine, and I am a grandmother speaking to you from a place where time has already taken almost everything except memory. And my daughter's name was Leora Hale, a name I chose because it sounded like light. Because when she was born, the nurse said she came out smiling as if she already knew the world would need her gentleness. And for 26 years, she lived exactly like that soft-spoken, stubbornly kind. The kind of girl who would stop on the side of the road to help strangers push broken cars. The kind who believed people were good, even when life kept proving otherwise. And on the night she died, I was folding her laundry. The scent of her shampoo still warm in the fabric, when the phone rang and a man with a voice trained to stay calm told me there had been an accident. A collision so violent it tore metal like paper. And I remember how my knees didn't buckle right away. How denial stood me up like an invisible wall. Because mothers are built to believe their children are indestructible even when logic says otherwise. And by the time I reached the hospital, the white lights had already stripped the night of its mercy. Doctors moving around her body as if she was still fully there, even though I could feel, deep in my bones, that my daughter was already slipping away from the world we shared. Her face swollen, broken, unrecognizable. And yet somehow I knew it was her because grief recognizes its own. And I held her hand cold, bruised, still mine, and whispered every apology I had ever owed her. Every thank you I forgot to say. Every prayer I no longer believed in but needed anyway. And somewhere between the beeping machines and the smell of antiseptic, a doctor pulled me aside and spoke words that would carve my soul in two, explaining brain death in a voice meant to be gentle but felt like gravel. Telling me that her heart was beating only because machines insisted it should. Telling me that the person my daughter was would never come back. And I nodded like a woman who understood, though understanding did not arrive until much later. And that is when they asked me about donation, not organs first, but everything. And I remember thinking how cruel it was to ask a mother for generosity at the exact moment life had robbed her of all of it. But then another doctor entered, younger, eyes rimmed red, and said there was a young woman in another wing of the hospital, burned and shattered by fire, her face destroyed beyond recognition. A woman named Morabelle Knox, only 19, who would never eat, speak, smile, or look at herself again without a miracle, and they said the word face carefully, as if whispering it might make it less terrifying. And the room tilted because what kind of mother agrees to give away the face she kissed goodnight for decades? The face she memorized when her daughter slept. The face she searched for in crowds even after Leora moved out. And I wanted to scream, to throw every paper back at them, to say my daughter had already given enough just by dying. But then I remembered Leora at 7 years old giving away her favorite toy to a crying child at the park. Remembered her at 15 sneaking food to a homeless woman behind the grocery store. Remembered her at 23 telling me, "Mom, if anything ever happens to me, don't let it be for nothing." Words I scolded her for because mothers don't entertain those conversations. And suddenly, the question wasn't about my pain anymore. It was about whether my daughter's kindness would die with her body or continue somewhere else. And I asked to see the girl who needed the transplant. Not her injuries, just her chart, her story. And they told me Morabelle had been trapped in a house fire started by a faulty heater. That she survived, but lost everything that made her recognizable, even to herself. That she cried whenever mirrors were near. That she begged doctors to let her sleep forever. And I felt something break open inside me, not heal. Not soften, but open, because grief does strange arithmetic. And in that moment, I realized my daughter's face could either be buried in the ground or used as a bridge back to life for someone standing on the edge of ending theirs. And I signed the papers with hands that shook so badly the nurse had to steady them. Knowing the world would never understand this choice, knowing I might not survive it myself, but believing desperately that love does not end when breath does. And when they wheeled Leora away for surgery, I kissed her forehead one last time, whispering, "Go help someone, baby. You always wanted to." And then I went home to a house that still smelled like her and waited. Waited through the longest night of my life, haunted by questions no one prepares you for. Like whether a mother has the right to give away something so personal, whether identity lives in flesh or memory, whether my daughter would forgive me for letting her face live on someone else. And when the call finally came saying the surgery was successful, that Morabel had survived the transplant, that my daughter's face now rested on another human being, I sat on the kitchen floor and cried, not because of relief, but because my grief had learned a new shape, one that would follow me for the rest of my days, and in the weeks that followed. The world discovered what I had done before I was ready to explain it. Headlines reducing my daughter to a medical miracle. Strangers calling me brave or monstrous depending on the day. Neighbors whispering when I passed. And I stayed silent because silence felt safer than defending a decision that even I did not fully understand yet. And every night I dreamed of my daughter calling me from across a fog, asking if she was still beautiful, asking if I remembered her real face, asking why I let strangers touch what was once hers. And I woke up every morning with the same question echoing in my chest: did I save a life? Or did I betray my own child? A question that did not answer itself until the day I received a letter written in shaky handwriting from a girl who said she was alive because of me. A girl who was afraid to meet me, afraid I would see my daughter instead of her, afraid I would hate the way she wore a face that once belonged to someone else. And I realized then that the story had only just begun, because grief doesn't end with death. And generosity doesn't end with giving, it continues into consequences no one warns you about. And what happened when I finally agreed to meet Morabel? When I looked into my daughter's eyes on another woman's face, nearly destroyed what was left of me. And that moment standing in a quiet hospital room, heart pounding, knowing one look could either heal or shatter us both, is something I will tell you next. Because that meeting changed everything I believed about love, loss, and what it truly means to let go. I thought donating my daughter's face was the hardest thing I would ever do. But nothing prepared me for the moment I saw it again alive on someone else. And when she spoke her first words to me, my knees gave out. I walked into that room thinking I was strong, but the moment I saw her face again, my body betrayed me, because grief recognizes its own even on a stranger. I did not tell anyone how terrified I was the morning I agreed to meet her, because fear has a way of making women like me look weak in a world that praises sacrifice without ever asking what it costs. And I'd already given more than anyone could see. Yet, as dawn slipped through the thin curtains of my bedroom, I sat on the edge of my bed with my hands folded like I was waiting for judgment. My heart pounding not with anticipation, but with dread so heavy it pressed into my lungs. Because no one prepares a mother for the moment she must face her child's face alive on someone else. And the house was too quiet, Leora's absence echoing in every corner. Her shoes still by the door where she kicked them off carelessly. Her mug still chipped the way she liked it. And I remember standing in front of the mirror, unable to meet my own eyes because I feared they would accuse me. Feared they would ask the question I kept burying: what kind of mother lets this happen? And yet I dressed lowly, deliberately, choosing clothes that felt neutral, almost invisible, because I did not want anything about me to compete with what that day already demanded. And as I drove to the hospital, my hand shook on the steering wheel. Each red light another opportunity to turn around. Another moment to escape a meeting I could not undo once it happened. And I thought about the first time I ever saw my daughter's face, red and wrinkled and furious at the world. How instinctively I knew her as mine. How biology and love fused into certainty. And the cruelty of fate that now required me to unlearn that certainty in order to survive. And when I arrived at the hospital, the building loomed like a judge, its glass reflecting a version of myself I barely recognized. Older, smaller, hollowed out by loss, and every step inside felt ceremonial, like a procession towards something sacred and dangerous. And when the nurse guided me down the hallway, her voice calm and practiced, I wanted to scream at her to stop speaking so gently, because gentleness felt insulting in the face of what waited behind that door. And she asked me if I needed water, if I needed a chair, if I needed time. And I nodded to all of it without hearing myself. Because time is a currency grief spends recklessly. And then she stopped, hand hovering near the door handle, and said softly, "She's nervous," as if that detail might protect me. And something in my chest cracked open, because of course, she was nervous. How does a girl prepare to meet the mother of the woman whose face she now wears? And I wondered if she was afraid I would hate her, afraid I would reclaim what I gave, afraid I would look at her and see only theft instead of survival. And before I could answer, the door opened, and the first thing I noticed was the silence inside that room. A thick, trembling silence filled with held breath and unspoken terror. And then I saw her, sitting upright on the bed, shoulders hunched like she expected a blow, hands gripping the blanket as if it anchored her to existence. And when our eyes met, something ancient and animal surged through me, my knees buckling without permission, my body responding before my mind could intervene, because I knew that face in a way no logic could undo. Knew the geography of it, the lines and curves memorized through years of motherhood, and yet it was not her, not Leora. And that contradiction hit me like a physical force, nausea rising, vision blurring. And I remember hearing a sound escape my throat that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. And the nurse steadied me, guiding me to a chair I did not remember choosing. And Morabelle, sweet, fragile Morabelle, began to cry before I could, tears streaming down a face still learning how to belong to her. And she whispered, "I'm so sorry," over and over, as if apology might absolve her existence. And that was the moment I understood something terrible and important, that survival carries its own guilt, that living when another dies is a burden no one prepares you to carry. And I leaned forward despite every instinct telling me to flee. Because mothers move toward pain when others move away, and I reached for her hands, those unfamiliar hands trembling beneath my palms. And I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she was alive because love had insisted on continuing. And my voice shook because conviction does not erase sorrow, it only gives it direction. And she looked at me with eyes that searched my face for permission. Permission to breathe, to smile, to exist without shame. And I realized then that my role had changed in a way I never asked for. I was no longer only a grieving mother. I was also a witness to someone else's rebirth. And the weight of that duality pressed on me harder than any judgment from the outside world. And we sat there for a long time without speaking, because words felt clumsy compared to the enormity of what passed between us. And when she finally spoke, her voice was hesitant, unsure of its place in that room, and she asked me what my daughter had been like, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence, as if learning Leora's story might teach her how to live with the fate she carried. And I told her things I had not told anyone else, small intimate details that only mothers remember: the way Leora hummed when she was nervous, the way she scrunched her nose when she laughed too hard, the way she believed fiercely in second chances. And Morabelle listened as if each word was a lifeline, nodding through tears, committing my daughter to memory not as a donor, but as a person. And in doing so she gave Leora something I feared she had lost, continuation not just of flesh, but of meaning, and still, that day followed me home in ways I could not escape. Because seeing that face alive reopened and wounds I thought had scarred over, and the world outside that room did not pause to let me process what had happened. Strangers praising my bravery, reporters requesting interviews, people treating my grief like a public resource, and resentment crept in quietly. Because grief becomes complicated when it is shared without consent, and there were moments shameful, fleeting moments when I envied Morabel for the attention, for the future, for the fact that her story was moving forward, while mine felt frozen in the moment of loss. And I hated myself for that envy because she had suffered in ways I could never fully comprehend. Burned and broken and nearly erased from existence, and yet grief is not logical. It does not care about fairness, it only demands acknowledgement. And some nights I dreamed that my daughter was standing in front of me without a face at all, asking me why I let her disappear, asking me whether she was still recognizable to the world. And I woke up gasping, heart racing, unsure whether I had unearthed her or erased her. And then Morabel would call, voice tentative but hopeful, telling me about her progress, about learning how to smile again, how to drink without spilling, how to look in the mirror without screaming. And each small victory felt like a thread pulling me forward, whether I wanted to move or not. And slowly, against my resistance, something shifted. Because meaning does not eliminate pain, but it gives it shape. And the more Morabel learned to live, the more I understood that my daughter's story had not ended, it had transformed. And that transformation demanded something from me I had not anticipated, acceptance. Not of the loss, but of the reality that love sometimes survives in unfamiliar forms. And when Morabel asked me weeks later if she could visit Leora's grave, fear flooded me like ice water, because graves are final in a way hospitals are not. And I realized that seeing her stand where my daughter rested would force me to confront the truth I had been circling without touching, that Leora was gone. Truly gone. And no miracle of medicine could undo that, and I wanted to say no. Wanted to protect myself from a pain I was not sure I could survive. But I said yes anyway, because mothers do not get to choose comfort over truth forever. And the day we stood together in that quiet cemetery, the wine lifting Maribel's hair, her hands shaking as she knelt, and she whispered, "Thank you to the earth that held my child." Something inside me finally collapsed, not in destruction, but in surrender, and I cried the way I had been holding back since the day of the accident. Cried not because I regretted my choice, but because I finally understood its cost. And Morabel reached for me, arms wrapping around my shoulders. And in that embrace I felt both the depth of my loss and the fragile beauty of what remained. And when she told me she would live a life worthy of the gift she received, not out of obligation but out of gratitude, I realized that grief does not ask us to forget, it asks us to transform. And that transformation is never clean or painless. But it is possible, and still, even after that moment, the story did not end there, because healing invites new questions. And the most difficult one was still waiting, whether I could truly see Morabel as herself and not as a living memorial to my daughter, and the answer to that question would be tested in a way I never expected. In a moment that nearly shattered everything we had built. And that is what I must tell you next. Because what happened after the grave forced me to confront the last and hardest truth of all. I thought the grave would give me closure. Instead, it opened a door I was not ready to walk through. And what happened next nearly destroyed the bond between us forever. I thought the worst was behind us. I was wrong. Healing has a way of reopening wounds you thought were sealed forever. After the day at the grave, after the wind had carried our words into the earth and the soil had swallowed both my daughter's name and my promises to keep living, I believed naively that something like peace might finally be allowed to enter my life. But grief is not linear. It does not move politely from pain to acceptance. It circles back, sharpens itself, waits until you lower your guard. and then strikes in places you did not know was still exposed. And the first sign that something was wrong came quietly, in the form of a hesitation in Maribel's voice the next time she called me. A pause too long, a breath held too tight, and she told me she had been invited to speak publicly about her transplant, about survival, about miracles, and the word miracle landed between us like broken glass. Because miracles erase cost, they polish pain into something consumable. And I could hear the fear in her voice, not fear of speaking, but fear of hurting me, and I told her she should go, that her story mattered, that she deserved to claim her life loudly after nearly losing it. And I meant it in that moment, I truly did. But when I watched the recording later, alone in my living room, my daughter's empty chair beside me, and I heard Maribel speak about her new face, about second chances, about gratitude. And I saw the audience cry and applaud and stand in awe. Something inside me twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. Because nowhere in that applause was there space for the mother who buried a child. Nowhere in those standing ovations was there acknowledgement of the girl whose life ended so another could continue. And I hated myself for that reaction, hated the jealousy that rose like bile. Because grief is supposed to make us generous, not resentful, and yet there I was, turning off the screen with shaking hands, feeling as though my daughter was being erased by celebration. And that night I dreamed of Leora again, but this time she was faceless, standing in a crowd that cheered while she remained unseen. And when I woke, I knew something in me had shifted, something dangerous and unresolved, and I tried to hide it. Because resentment is a shameful companion to loss. And when Maribel called to tell me how nervous she had been, how relieved she felt afterward, how she hoped I wasn't upset, I lied, told her I was proud, told her she did beautifully. And the lie tasted like metal in my mouth. And this is the part of grief. No one wants to hear about the part where love and pain collide so violently they blur into something neither noble nor kind. And the world did not help, because people began to recognize Maribel everywhere, to stop her on the street, to ask for photos, to call her inspirational. And occasionally they would turn to me, if they knew who I was, and thank me as if gratitude were sufficient compensation for burying a child. And I would smile and nod and go home and collapse into a silence so heavy it pressed into my bones. Because grief becomes lonelier when it is misunderstood. And then came the day that broke what fragile balance we had built. The day Maribel arrived at my house unannounced. Eyes red, hands shaking, holding a magazine I had not yet seen. And she stood in my doorway like a child waiting for punishment. And she showed me the cover of her face, my daughter's face, staring back at me under a headline that read the face of survival. And something inside me snapped, not in anger at her, but in despair at the world that reduced our story to spectacle. And I felt words rise to my tongue that I could not stop. Words sharp and cruel and unfair. And I said, "They're forgetting her." And the moment they left my mouth, I wanted to pull them back. But it was too late. Because Maribel's face crumpled in a way that reminded me too much of Leora at 8 years old, when I once accused her of lying. And she whispered, I try so hard to remember her, and shame flooded me so fast I could barely breathe. Because I had just placed the weight of my grief onto someone already carrying more than anyone should. And she began to apologize again, that reflex she could not unlearn. Apologizing for being alive. Apologizing for being seen. Apologizing for existing in a way that hurt me. And I realized then that if I did not confront my resentment honestly, it would destroy us both. Because unresolved grief does not stay contained, it spills outward, poisoning relationships built on the very love meant to heal us. And I told her the truth, not the ugly version, but the necessary one, that seeing her celebrated sometimes made me feel invisible. That watching the world move on, while I stayed frozen in loss, made me afraid my daughter would be remembered only as a medical donor and not as a person. And Maribel listened without interrupting. tears streaming down her face. She was still learning how to feel. And when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way that humbled me. And she said something that changed everything. I don't want to live as her replacement. I want to live as proof that she mattered. And in that moment, I understood that we were both fighting the same erasure from opposite sides. She afraid of being nothing more than a vessel. Me afraid of my daughter being reduced to a footnote. And that realization did not erase the tension, but it reframed it, and still, the true test came weeks later, when Morabel told me she had been offered a long-term media project, interviews, appearances, a chance to turn her survival into a platform. And she asked me hesitantly, respectfully, if I would stand beside her publicly, if I would share Leora's story with her. And fear surged through me so powerfully it left me dizzy. Because speaking publicly meant surrendering control of my grief to an audience that might misunderstand it, judge it, consume it, and discard it. And I wanted to say no. Wanted to retreat into the privacy of my sorrow. But I saw the hope in Maribel's eyes, not ambition but purpose. And I realized that protecting my pain might come at the cost of silencing my daughter's life. And so I agreed, not because I was ready, but because motherhood taught me long ago that readiness is not required for courage. And the day of that first joint interview, I sat under bright lights that erased softness. My hands folded in my lap like they were holding something fragile. And when the interviewer asked me how it felt to see my daughter's face on another woman, the room went quiet, and every instinct told me to offer a polished answer. Something inspirational, something palatable. But instead I told the truth, my voice trembling as I spoke of contradiction, of love and loss coexisting without resolution, of pride tangled with pain. And I watched as the audience leaned forward, not for a miracle, but for honesty. And when Morabel spoke afterward, she did not talk about heroism or destiny. She talked about responsibility, about carrying a life forward that was not hers to replace, about honoring a woman she would never meet, but would always be connected to. And something remarkable happened in that space, not healing, not closure, but recognition. And for the first time since the accident, I felt seen not as a symbol, but as a mother. And still, the story demanded one more reckoning, because after the cameras turned off and the applause faded, I returned home to the same quiet house, and grief waited for me there, patient and unrelenting. And that night I stood in my daughter's room and realized I had been avoiding something essential, something I had delayed out of fear that I had not truly said goodbye, not in a way that allowed me to live beyond survival. And I knew then that my final act of love for Leora would require a choice that frightened me more than donating her face ever did. A choice that would redefine how I carried her memory for the rest of my life. And that choice, one that forced me to let go in a way I had been resisting, was approaching faster than I could prepare for. Because grief does not wait for permission to evolve. And what I did next, the decision I made alone in that room, surrounded by my daughter's belongings, is something I've never spoken aloud until now. Because it marked the moment I finally understood that love does not mean holding on forever, and that letting go does not mean forgetting. And that final lesson, the hardest of all, came at a cost I never anticipated. Asterisk, I thought speaking publicly would heal me. Instead, it forced me to confront the one goodbye I had been avoiding. And the choice I made next changed how I live with my daughter's memory forever. I thought letting go meant losing her forever. I didn't know it was the only way to keep her with me. And the decision I made that night changed everything. I stood alone in my daughter's room long after the cameras stopped, following our story, and the world returned to its appetite for the next miracle. The door closed, the air still, the silence loud enough to bruise. And for the first time since the accident, I did not feel chased by memory, but surrounded by it. Leora's presence woven into every object, as if the room itself remembered her better than I had allowed myself to. The faint indentation on the pillow where her head once rested, The scuffed desk chair she refused to replace because it still worked. The folded sweater at the foot of the bed she never finished unpacking after her last visit. And I realized with a sudden, frightening clarity that I had turned this room into a shrine not for remembrance, but for avoidance. A place I visited to feel pain without ever letting it transform. And I sat on the edge of her bed holding a box I had kept sealed since the funeral. Letters she wrote to me over the years, cards she never mailed, scraps of paper with jokes and reminders and half-finished thoughts. And as I opened it, my hand shook not because of sadness alone, but because of fear. Because inside that box lived a version of my daughter that demanded I keep living. And the first letter I unfolded was dated years earlier, written in a handwriting that slanted upward when she was excited. And it began, "Mom, if you're reading this, it probably means I chickened out of saying it out loud." And I laughed and cried at the same time because even in ink she sounded like herself. And she wrote about gratitude, about how she learned compassion from watching me survive my own losses, about how she hoped she would grow into someone who left the world softer than she found it. And at the bottom she wrote something that made my breath hitch. "If anything ever happens to me, promise you won't build your life around my absence." And I pressed the paper to my chest, finally understanding that my grief had been disobeying her all along. And in that moment, the decision I had been avoiding rose to the surface. Terrifying and necessary, I needed to release this room, not erase it, not discard it, but transform it into something that faced forward instead of backward. And the next morning I called Morabel and asked if she would come over. Not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a young woman still learning how to inhabit her life. And when she arrived, she hesitated in the doorway like she always did, unsure of her place in my home, and I invited her in with a steadiness that surprised even me. And I told her what I intended to do, that I wanted to turn Leora's room into a scholarship space, a place for letters, for mentorship, for young women who had lost parts of themselves and needed guidance to imagine a future again. And Maribel's eyes filled with tears, not of guilt this time, but of recognition, and she asked if she could help. Not out of obligation, but because she wanted to be part of something that honored life without consuming it. And together we began the slow, careful process of choosing what stayed and what moved forward. Each object a conversation, each memory a negotiation between holding on and letting go. And as we worked, I noticed something profound. The face she carried no longer pulled me backward into shock. It anchored me in the present, a reminder not of what I lost, but of what endured. And in the weeks that followed, the room changed, light returning to it in ways I had not allowed before. Grief loosening its grip, not because it disappeared, but because it finally had somewhere to go. And word spread quietly, not through headlines, but through human need. And letters began to arrive from young women burned by trauma of different kinds, accidents, violence, illness, asking for guidance, asking for hope, asking if survival could feel like living again. And I answered everyone, my grandmother's hands aching but steady. Because age teaches you that legacy is not what you leave behind, but what you build forward. And Morabel became part of that work, not as a representative of tragedy, but as proof that life after devastation is complicated and real, and worthy of patience. And still, the final test came when the anniversary of the accident approached. The date circled in red on calendars I pretended not to keep. And Morabel asked me a question that made my chest tight on whether I wanted to attend a small, private gathering she planned. Not for the media, not for donors or doctors, but for the people who loved her and the people who loved Leora. Together, in the same space, and fear rose because blending griefs risks collision. Because honoring two lives in one room risks comparison. And I worried my pain would spill in ways I could not control. But I said yes, because fear is no longer my compass. And on that evening, I watched as Morabel stood in front of a small group holding a candle. Her voice steady as she spoke my daughter's name, not as a sacrifice, but as a source. And she said something I will carry with me to my last breath. That she does not wake up trying to replace a woman she never met. That she wakes up trying to live in a way that justifies the love that saved her. And as the candle light flickered across her face, I did not see my daughter resurrected or stolen. I saw continuity, not of flesh but of intention. And I felt something inside me finally settle, not into peace but into acceptance. The kind that does not demand silence or erasure. And afterward, when the room emptied and the candles burned low, Morabel and I sat together without words. The bond between us no longer defined by tragedy alone, but by choice. And I realized then that motherhood had expanded beyond biology, beyond laws, into something larger and more enduring. And in the days that followed, I began speaking to my grandchildren about Leora, not with hushed voices, but with laughter. Telling stories that made a human instead of holy. Letting them know that grief does not mean stopping, that love does not mean clinging, and that generosity is sometimes the bravest form of survival. And as my body aged and my steps slowed, the story continued without me needing to carry it alone. Because Morabel took up her life with a quiet determination that humbled me. Finishing school, volunteering, loving, stumbling, getting back up. Living not as a miracle, but as a woman. And every so often she would call me just to tell me something ordinary, a bad day, a good meal, a silly joke, and I would smile because ordinary is the truest victory of all. And now, as I sit here telling you this story with hands that have buried loved ones and held newborns and signed papers no mother ever imagined signing, I understand something I could not see at the beginning, that identity is not owned by flesh, that memory is not threatened by transformation, and that letting go does not mean losing, it means allowing love to change shape. And if you ask me whether I would make the same choice again, whether I would donate my daughter's face knowing the cost, knowing the nights of doubt and resentment and fear, I would tell you yes, not because it was noble or heroic, but because it taught me how to live after the unthinkable. And if my story reaches you where you are grieving, surviving, standing at a crossroads, you never ask for, then know this from an old woman who has carried both unbearable loss and unexpected grace. Love does not end when life does. It waits for us to decide whether we will let it keep working through us, and that decision, more than any miracle, is what saves us in the end. I thought this was where the story would end, but there is one last truth I need to say, one final goodbye, oh my daughter, and that is what I will tell you next. This is the part one avoided telling anyone, because it's where I finally said goodbye to my daughter, and where I learned what love really asks of us. I am older now than I ever imagined I would be when Leora was born. My reflection, a map of years layered with loss and survival. And as I sit here telling you this story with a grandmother's voice that trembles more from memory than age, I understand that endings are not moments, but processes, slow and merciless and necessary. And the final chapter of this journey did not arrive with a dramatic decision or public recognition, but with a quiet morning when I realized I no longer spoke to my daughter in the past tense only. That I spoke to her in gratitude rather than apology. And that realization frightened me at first, because grief can feel like the last thread tying us to those we lose. And loosening it feels like betrayal. But betrayal of pain is not betrayal of love. And it took me years to learn that distinction. Years of waking up expecting to hear her footsteps in the hallway. Years of instinctively reaching for the phone to tell her something ordinary before remembering she was no longer there to answer. Years of guilt for laughing too loudly on good days, as if joy itself might erase her. And then, one afternoon, while sitting in the small community room that used to be her bedroom, now filled with letters and laughter and young women finding their footing again, I watched Morabel speak to a girl whose hands shook the same way hers once did. And I saw something unmistakable pass between them, not replacement, not inheritance. but continuity of courage, and I felt the last heavy stone in my chest finally shift. Not disappear, but settle into a place where it no longer crushed my breath. And later that evening, Morabel and I walked together to the cemetery. Not because it was an anniversary or a symbolic date, but because grief does not follow calendars. And we stood there quietly, the air cool, the sky wide. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing at the side of an ending, but at the root of something that had grown beyond my understanding. And I spoke to Leora aloud without choking on the words, telling her about the work we were doing. About the girls who wrote letters, saying they no longer felt invisible. About the small ways her kindness had multiplied. And I thanked her not for dying. Never for that, but for teaching me how to choose generosity, even when the world had taken everything. And in that moment, I finally allowed myself to release the one lie grief had been whispering to me since the accident, that if I stopped hurting so sharply, it meant she mattered less, and the truth arrived gently and devastatingly clear. Love is not measured by pain. It is measured by what we build from it. And after that day, I began to live in a way that did not orbit tragedy alone. I traveled with my grandchildren, told them stories that made Leora human and funny and flawed. Not frozen in perfection, I let my home fill with noise again. Let ordinary days matter. And when people asked me if donating my daughter's face had been the hardest decision of my life, I surprised myself by answering honestly that the hardest decision came after. The decision to keep living without apologizing for surviving. And Morabel grew into herself with a strength that never pretended the past didn't exist. She fell in love and got her heart broken and laughed about it later. She stood in front of mirrors without fear. She lived not as a symbol, but as a woman. And the face she carried became simply her face, not a relic, not a burden. And that is when I knew the donation had truly completed its purpose. Not when the surgery succeeded, not when the headlines faded, but when the identity attached to that face returned fully to the person living behind it. And now, as I look back from the far side of grief, I understand that what I gave was not my daughter's face alone, but my permission for love to move forward without me controlling its shape. And if you are listening to this story because you are standing in your own impossible moment, weighing a decision no one should have to make, carrying guilt for surviving or resentment for being asked to be strong when you were shattered, hear this from an old woman who has lived through the aftermath. There is no perfect choice, only honest ones. And the measure of love is not whether it spares us pain, but whether it allows life to continue with meaning. And when my time comes, when my voice finally quiets and my hands rest, I know I will meet my daughter without fear of her judgment, because I did not preserve her face out of fear of loss. I released it out of faith in love. And if she asks me whether it was worth it, I will tell her yes, not because it was easy, not because it made me a better person, but because it taught me how to let love outlive grief. And that, more than anything, is what saved me. I didn't lose my daughter the day she died. I lost her the day I stopped living in her absence. And I found her again the moment I chose love over fear. Now that you have heard my story, I want you to understand this not as a lesson, not as inspiration, but as truth spoken by a grandmother who has buried her child and lived to tell it. Love does not always look like holding on. Sometimes it looks like letting go with shaking hands and trusting that what you gave was never meant to die with you. And if my daughter's face taught the world anything, it is that identity is deeper than skin, that memory is stronger than death, and that even in our most unbearable moments, we still have the power to choose what our pain becomes. And I will carry Leora with me until my last breath, not in sorrow alone, but in purpose. Because grief may change us forever, but love, if we allow it, will always find a way to keep living.